It's a pleasure and an honor to welcome Joseph E. Stiglitz to this conversation in the Kerala Dialogue series. As many of our viewers know, Professor Stiglitz is a Nobel laureate and university professor at Columbia University, New York, and I'm an alumnus of that university. He received the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences in 2001 for his pioneering analysis of markets with asymmetric information. He's co-chair of the high-level expert group on the measurement of economic performance and social progress at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD, and the chief economist of the Roosevelt Institute. Professor Stiglitz is a former chief economist of the World Bank and a former member and chairman of the US President's Council of Economic Advisors. In 2000, Professor Stiglitz founded the Initiative for Policy Dialogue, a think tank on international development based at Columbia University. In the area of public policy, he has contributed significantly to the design of the measurement of economic performance and social progress, and as I mentioned, chairs that high-level expert group at the OECD. Professor Stiglitz's contribution to economics are manifold, and quite obviously this introduction is not meant to do justice to these contributions. He helped create a new branch in the field, the economics of information, exploring the consequences of information asymmetries and pioneering such concepts as adverse selection and moral hazard, which have become standard tools I read in the economics literature. He has made contributions to macroeconomics and monetary theory, to development economics and trade theory, to public and corporate finance, to the theories of industrial organization and rural organization, to the economics of R&D, and to the theories of welfare economics and of income and wealth distribution. His academic publications run into the many hundreds. Over the past 2 decades, I'm very pleased to see he has written a series of popular books with globalization and its discontents, published in 2002, which has been translated into 35 languages and sold over 1 million, and the note says non-pirated copies. If you add the pirated list, it will be much more. Over the period, he has published, among other contributions, influential books on the true cost of the Iraq War, the price of inequality, and on how today's divided society endangers the future, creating a learning society, unequal societies and what we could do about them, people, power and profits, and progressive capitalism. That's the title of a subtitle of a book, For an Age of Discontent. And as a journalist, I'm delighted to say that the economist Stiglitz is among a small minority of distinguished scholars who believe in engaging directly and regularly with the public on issues that matter through the medium of journalism. I don't know how many of us know, how many of you know that in 2010, he received the Gerald Loeb Award for commentary for his Vanity Fair essay, Capitalist Fools and Wall Street's Toxic Message. Joe, do you remember that?
Yes, I do.
I can think of only 2 other Nobel laureates in economics, Amartya Sen and Paul Krugman, who have been doing this in a committed way. Professor Stiglitz's most recent journalistic writings have focused on what should be the policy priorities in what he calls the COVID-19 economy. And I shall come to that subject in a minute. Before that, let me briefly introduce to our viewers our 2 panelists who will be engaging Professor Stiglitz in a conversation that I'll be anchoring over the next hour or so. Professor Mridul Eapen, an economist, is Honorary Fellow at the Center for Development Studies, Thiruvananthapuram. R. Ramakumar is NABARD Chair Professor of Economics at the School of Development Studies at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences. Both are members of the Kerala State Planning Board, where Professor Eapen handles gender and social protection, and Professor Ramakumar, agriculture and allied activities. So welcome to this conversation, Professor Stiglitz.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll start it off with this question. You have recently written that the most urgent policy priorities today will require hard choices and a show of political will. Would you summarize for our viewers the current economic outlook and the most urgent policy priorities for the COVID-19 economy?
Well, when the pandemic started, many people thought that there was going to be a short interruption to the economy, a lockdown of a couple of weeks, and then a V-shaped recovery. And by the latest beginning of June, we would resume back where we left off sometime in early spring. Well, that was a fantasy, and I think it's now recognized to be a fantasy. The pandemic is continuing to get worse in many countries: Brazil, United States, India. The numbers in the United States reach new records every day, both in the number of disease and the number of people dying. It's not under control. What has happened here in New York, where I live, is actually very telling, because it has been brought under control, although we worry because we're confronted with a world in which it's not been put under control. So that raises a couple of questions. The kinds of policies that were designed for a short interruption are clearly different from the kinds of policies that we need in the face of a pandemic that will be with us for months and months, and possibly even years. Even when there's a pandemic and there's a vaccine, and a lot of hype about that, we don't know how effective it will be. We don't know whether there will be a reluctance in some people in the population, significant numbers in the population, to take the vaccine. We don't know how long the vaccine will be effective. We don't know how capable the private sector will be in providing the vaccine to the 7 billion people around the world. So there's a lot of uncertainty, and our policies have to be designed to reflect that. What I said, though, in the beginning of the pandemic, I think is still true, that there are we should have a clear set of priorities. And unfortunately, in the United States and in many other countries, what was done didn't reflect the priorities. So let me lay those out. The first priority is our health. We aren't going to have an economic recovery until we have the pandemic under control. And that in the United States, for instance, what that meant is we had to have paid sick leave. We don't want people who are contagious going to work. But in a world where, even in a rich country like the United States, a large fraction of the people, so half, are living paycheck to paycheck. And that means if they are sick and don't have paid sick leave, they will go to work. There's no choice. And that means the disease spreads. And this illustrates, I think, what I would call both a short-sighted and a ugly side of capitalism that we've seen in the United States. Congress passed a law saying, just for COVID-19, we will have 10 paid sick leave days of sick leave. That made an enormous amount of sense. But then the richest companies in America, the most powerful companies in America, said, we are too selfish. We are too short-sighted to support this. And they lobbied to get an exemption. And they succeeded. So the companies with more than 500 employees are exempt. That means essentially 48, 48%, half of all workers, do not have paid sick leave in a very rich country. I think it's unconscionable, but again, is also short-sighted. So the first priority is health. Right now, the Republicans in the United States are opposing more money for help for the states and localities, which are the front line in providing health care. They're opposing adequate money for testing. They're opposing money that is needed for health. So that's the first priority. The second priority is protecting the vulnerable. You know, I mentioned just a minute ago that half of Americans living paycheck to paycheck, and the paychecks have stopped. The numbers who are unemployed, something like somewhere between 20 and 30% of the population. Hard to get exact data because the unemployment insurance offices have been incapable of keeping up with a large number of applications. We've never had anything like this, even in the Great Depression, in terms of the rash of new applicants. There are clearly lots of people whose source of income has suddenly disappeared, so we have to protect them. We did a fairly good job, and we spent almost $3 trillion. And one of the things that worries me is that developing countries don't have the resources to do that. So a few rich countries can get away with this, but what is going to happen to those who are less well off? So that's the second priority. And part of that, protecting the vulnerable, is not only getting income to them, but making sure they are not evicted from their apartment, that they don't lose their cars, they don't wind mired in debt. And we went some ways, but only halfway in addressing these issues. The third priority, very important, is that we wanted to be in a good position to, when the pandemic is put under control, to recover. Most European countries, New Zealand, therefore put a lot of priority in keeping workers attached to their firm, so that once the pandemic was put under control in them, they would be able to restart again. The United States failed. I described the high levels of unemployment. Other countries did much, much better in keeping people attached to their firm, important for a whole variety of reasons, including continuity in the provision of healthcare, a sense of dignity, an attachment to the workforce. So we failed, and there's a long story about why we failed, but the evidence is overwhelming. So I think that at this juncture, we're facing a new question, and that is, can we sustain the kind of support that we had in the first few weeks and months? What worries me is that if we don't do that, all that we spent, the trillions of dollars, will have been for naught. We delayed the bankruptcy of small businesses by 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 10 weeks, and that was good, but they're going to go bankrupt anyway. And the data that is now coming in the United States suggests that unless we do something more, that we will have only delayed the onslaught. And unfortunately, again, in the United States, the lack of leadership has meant that there isn't anything yet forthcoming. It's a source of big debate. So I think the important thing is making sure that any programs are sustainable. Now, there are a couple of other things I'll just mention now, and we can come back to them in the discussion later. I talked about it very much from a single country perspective, but we have a global economy, and what happens in one country affects others. And we are in a new global world. Two aspects of that I'll just mention. One of them is many countries before the pandemic had taken on excessive debt, both in terms of sovereigns, but private companies as well. The low interest rate, close to zero interest rate environment in the United States and in Europe encouraged that kind of excessive indebtedness. And now we're going to have debt crises. And the financial firms have been recalcitrant. They're ostriches putting their head in the sand, pretending there's not a pandemic, refusing to restructure, pretending you can squeeze water out of a stone, and acting in a short-sighted and inhumane way as they did in 2008. Very much a concern to me. And the second thing is, in the aftermath of 2008 crisis, the emerging markets played a very big role in the resuscitation of the global economy. That's not going to happen this time. So I worry that the global recovery may be much more difficult this time. If it had been a V-shaped recovery, we would have bounced back, but we're not there. And the longer it goes, the more the damage to balance sheets, the damage of households and firms, and the more bankruptcies. And so while the origins of the downturn are markedly different than they were in 2008, the scars are already forming. And the question is, how are we going to emerge from this pandemic?
Thank you. Just one other thought. You've been focusing on inequalities, but during this pandemic, it looks like the pandemic as well as the lockdowns we see in many places, seem to intensify inequalities in education, especially school education. In India, you know how many India, you've been here many times. How many rural households have access to computers? You can't, I think, do online courses through a mobile phone. So any thoughts on that for rich countries as well as countries like India?
No, you're absolutely right. One of the very striking things is this virus is not an equal opportunity virus. It goes after those who have health conditions, and that's very highly correlated with those whose income is low, and especially in countries like the United States and India, where there's inadequate provision of health services, and in countries where there are nutritional problems. It's the disease itself is hurting the poor. But in addition, the economic impact is going after strongest for you might call it the frontline workers, the people who come in contact with other people. And disproportionately, it seems ironic, but the people who are the poorest are also the people most exposed to the disease. They live in close quarters with each other. And so even if the health conditions were exactly the same, the disease would afflict those at the bottom much more. And then the point that you raised is one that's bothered me a great deal. The effects are likely to perpetuate inequalities, because not only are the incomes of the poor suffering even more, health is suffering even more, but they're not able to get access to education. And so the next generation will be afflicted unless we really target programs to try to at least ameliorate these effects to some extent.
Thank you. Professor Eapen,
yeah.
would you like to come in now?
Yeah. Taking off from this discussion on priorities and political will, sustainability, I thought a slightly different way of looking at it, and I wanted to ask you, I'm sure you're aware of the history of public action in Kerala, which has ensured a better life for its people, even at low levels of income. Now, what I'd like to know is, what have the pandemic and lockdown taught us about the importance of public action in economic development?
Well, I think, let me put it more broadly. What the pandemic has showed is how important social protection systems, including health, are before a pandemic, that countries that had better public health systems obviously were better able to cope with the pandemic. Those who make sure their citizens had better health, nutrition, are better able to cope with the pandemic. But the second thing is, everywhere in the world, when you face a catastrophe like this, and the pandemic is a catastrophe, they turn to government.
Yeah.
And the ability of government to respond to risks is absolutely essential. But 40 years of neoliberalism, 40 years of Reagan, Thatcher's trying to strip away the power of the state meant that in many countries, the government didn't have the capacity of responding. And we see it very vividly in countries like the United States and the UK. The irony was that under Obama, we created in the White House an office within the National Security Council. We realized that a security issue. We created a White House office on pandemics. And then under President Trump, that office was disbanded. And we also had a Centers for Disease Control. The government is at the forefront of protecting us against contagious disease. But under Trump, that was defunded. We also realized that if we had a crisis, we needed stockpiles of masks, of protective gear. And the Trump administration allowed those to be depleted. So in every possible way, the stripping away the power of the state meant that we were not able to respond. Countries like New Zealand that had a strong government, not authoritarian, very democratic government, but that doesn't mean, it was a very competent government, actually were able to totally stem the spread of the disease. So I think there are a lot of lessons here about why government is important. And as you emphasized, important as part of the development process and part of the thing, one of the things that Kerala has done very well is promoting the health and education of their citizens.
Yeah.
Thank you. Ramakumar?
Professor Stiglitz, it's a great pleasure talking to you. I just wanted to take off from the point that you just mentioned. Do you think mainstream economic theory stands discredited in the wake of the pandemic? Can there be a new consensus in favor of redrawing and extending the boundaries of state intervention in what can be called as a post-COVID era in our lives?
Oh, well, I think the pandemic has highlighted not only the importance of the public sector, as I've just described, the importance of government. We need it, you know, in Kerala, you need it to promote development, but everywhere you need it as part of a social protection against disaster. But it's also exposed the weakness of the private sector, the short-sightedness of the private sector. We created supply chains that were not resilient. So it has been absolutely remarkable in a country that thinks of itself as the most advanced country in the world. We could not produce masks, simple products like masks. We could not produce protective gear in the quantities and at the pace we needed. We couldn't do more complicated things like producing tests. We couldn't produce ventilators. There's also something else that I want to raise, which is applicable both to government and the private sector. One of the reasons that New Zealand was so successful is that there was trust in government. And the government relied on expertise, and when the government said you have to wear a mask, that you have to protect other people, there was a social solidarity and people responded. They trusted the government. They didn't trust the government in the United States. We had a government that is famous for lying 5, 10, 15, 20 times a day. And not small lies, but big lies. So there is no trust in government at all. There's also a lack of trust in the private sector. It's hard to have trust in the private sector if you don't have trust in government. Why do I say that? Because you're going to have in the private sector people who are going to scam, take advantage of others, exploit others, and you develop a kind of social cohesion where that doesn't happen. You have a scammer as the president, so money off of taking advantage of others. So that has become sort of the economic model. So what happened when we had tests? We had private companies saying that they had tests, but the tests didn't work. You needed the government to test the test, to make sure that the test had validity. But we had taken away the power of the government. So the government, nobody could trust the government to test the test. Nobody could trust the private sector tests. And the result of this is that we had an unprecedented spread of the disease. It shows the weakness of that kind of neoliberal model that just assumed that markets on their own worked well. There's one more aspect that I want to emphasize that picks up on another thing that we've become first order importance in recent years. The pandemic is a quintessential example of an externality. I do affects others. It's not, can't be priced very easily. The whole basis of market economy, reliance on market economy, is that externalities are not important.
Yeah.
Obviously, externalities are first order importance. And of course, when we think about externalities, the other obvious example of the importance of externalities is climate change. So the two things that should be the center of our attention, pandemic and climate change, are things that are beyond the market.
Can I just say one thing, Dr.
Please go ahead.
You know, what you said just now, Professor Stiglitz, seems to, seems to suggest that our historical legacy of public action has actually paid off to a large extent in Kerala.
Yes, very much so. I think one has to, firm believer that you need markets. That's the last book that was referred to as where I call people, power, and profits. a progressive capitalism, or what we call it a social democracy. In a large country, you need a role for entrepreneurship, for individual action, but it has to be regulated and complemented by public action, by public investment, by public development. And you have to get that balance right. And Kerala has been one place where you've done a lot of the public investment in health and in education. And as I said, I worry about in the United States that we've invested in health and education and nutrition. And one of the reasons life expectancy in the United States today is lower than it was in 2015. Isn't that amazing? A country that is leading in health has life expectancy in 2020 that is almost surely lower than it was in 2015.
A panelist should bear in mind that we have about 25 minutes at most. So, Professor Ramakumar.
Yeah. Professor Stiglitz, I just wanted to bring one more element into the discussion. I remember reading that you were a part of the crowd which listened to the famous speech, "I Have a Dream," of Martin Luther King in August 1963. Your research afterwards, particularly in the United States, has shown that the recent phase of capitalism, progress has been eroded, probably even reversed, by growing economic divisions and rising racial inequalities. Now, given that the pandemic has disproportionately hit historically disadvantaged sections, for example, the African Americans in the United States, or the oppressed caste groups or tribal groups in countries like India, how should we view social policy after the pandemic? How differently should we view social policy after the pandemic?
Well, it's actually been a moment of reckoning in the United States, and I think in other countries as well. You might say, as bad as the pandemic has been and as discriminatory as this virus is, the positive side is the enormous resonance to the Black Lives Matter movement. It's not just African Americans who are raising this issue, not only Native Americans, but it's become something that most Americans care about. You see that in the polls, partly the vividness with which we saw the violence against African Americans that we all had read about, but the new technology brings it into our home and we can see it. And it also is occurring in the context of a country where we have a racist president and a president who is encouraging violence. So it's really brought home the division in our values across our society. And the divisions in our society. I did a study a year and a half ago in the aftermath of the 1968 riots in the United States. The President Johnson set up a commission called the Kerner Commission and said what was going on to investigate. And it was very clear, deep-seated racism in the United States. And it called for addressing that in every dimension. So 2018 marked the 50th anniversary. And there was an effort to reassess where we were, to say how much progress we've made in a half a century. And I tell you, it was disappointing. in the aftermath of what had gone on in '68, there was progress. But with Nixon and Reagan and Republicans, we went back. Some of the progress we lost. And so if you look at the data today, yes, we had some victories. We had a president who was an African-American. We have CEOs of some companies that are African-Americans. But you look at the average data, the wealth gap, the income gap, it's very, very large. And so our progress has not been what we hoped. And I think that this is a moment that the pandemic has brought this out so vividly that I am hopeful, actually. Certainly, I feel that within the Democratic Party, there is a strong commitment to redress these injustices that have continued on for so long.
Mridul?
Yeah, you see, another disproportionately disadvantaged section, which became very visible during the pandemic, was the migrant workers. I mean, you must have heard and seen visuals of the miserable plight of hundreds and thousands of migrant workers who were left stranded with the sudden announcement of the lockdown, and they were walking home. So I just wanted to get your view on this. How do you think economic policy could have redressed the situation?
Well, this goes back to the point I made in terms of the priorities, which is one of the priorities should have been protecting the most vulnerable. That should have been one of the priorities. And the problem in India, the migrants, I've seen in other developing countries. One of the countries where people live in the city and have their farm where they grow the food outside the city. But then they had these lockdowns, and the people in the city couldn't get to their farms. So they were facing starvation. Even if there were ways in which they could have safely gone between the two. So there's almost a lack of humanity. If you recognize that your policies are going to result in people not having income, you have to give them income. That should be the first priority. You shouldn't say, well, let them starve. It was almost, as I say, unconscionable behavior that you did that in India and in a few other countries, that people didn't take into account the utter the huge impact that the policies that were designed to contain the disease didn't do that. But they, whether that was effective or not, they didn't take into account what that would do to the ability to survive of the people who were locked down. So this is, at least in the United States, I can say for all the criticism that I've given and failures, at least there was an agreement on all sides that we had to protect the people who were going to be vulnerable. We didn't always do it as successfully, but that was a clear priority. And it was such a disappointment to see what happened in India.
Professor Stiglitz, that brings us to the question of response of governments. There have been unprecedented responses to an unprecedented crisis on the part of governments across the world. In the Western economies, you see these revival packages already costing them about 10 to 15% of the GDP. And this is just to hold on. When we emerge at the other end of the lockdown, you will require many classical Keynesian type of revival packages and so on. That will cost probably another 10 or 15% of the GDP. What are the sustainable ways to mobilize resources for such unprecedented interventions, not just in developed countries, but also for countries like India?
Yeah, so first let me say that the approach that most countries took was we were fighting a war against a virus, but it was a war. And when you go to war, you don't ask, can you afford it? When the United States was attacked by Japan at Pearl Harbor, we didn't say, let's take out our pencils and see if we can afford to respond. We responded, and then we said, we're going to have to make whatever sacrifice to win. Okay, and I think I think that was the right answer. We're going to win against this pandemic, and we'll figure out how to do it. But you're absolutely right. Now that we're seeing how much it costs, resources are scarce. That's what economics is about. They're not as scarce as we sometimes think, because in many of our countries we have underutilized resources. And one of the things that we can do is try to make sure that we fully utilize our resources. Even in the United States, where the official unemployment rate was 3-4%, that disguised a lot of underemployment. So we did have underutilized resources, but even that might be equivalent to a few percentage of GDP, but not the numbers that you mentioned, 10, 15, 20, 25% of GDP. So I think there is going to have to be, at some point, a recognition that going to have to increase, and then the question is taxes on whom? And in some countries, the answer is easy. In the United States, we have a regressive tax system. That is to say, the people at the top pay a smaller percentage of income than those down below. The hedge funds pay lower taxes than a plumber, people who work for a living. So just making our tax system fair would generate huge amounts of income. Making it progressive would generate even more income. Correcting the distortions in our tax system would generate huge amounts of income. So that is going to be part of the answer. I also think that we ought to keep in mind what I call a basic principle: better to tax bad things than good things. So tax pollution, tax excessive short-term capital speculation. So there are many kinds of taxes that would actually improve the functioning of our society. And then finally, I think we obviously have to rethink priorities and spending. We spend a lot of money on subsidies to fossil fuels, which make the problem of climate change even worse. That's a no-brainer. You should get rid of that. But we are spending trillions of dollars on weapons that don't work against enemies that don't exist. The defense industry. We should get rid of that. So I think this is a moment where we ought to be rethinking every aspect of our economic and social policy. And out of this, I think can emerge actually a better functioning economy and society.
From what you say, the post-COVID world is likely to look very different compared to the pre-COVID world. But can I take it to a larger, broader level now? do you think capitalism in its present avatar can survive the pandemic, given the kind of responses that we are seeing? And do you expect major changes in the organization of production, which is central to the way capitalism works, to emerge after the pandemic?
Not capitalism as such, but capitalism in its present avatar, underlying avatar.
Yeah, I think that's going to be a big debate and a point of contention. You know, I think obviously the people with market power, the people who exploit others, will want to go back. And they'll try to do a few minimal changes, but a system that worked well for the 1% or the 0.1%, they're going to try to use their economic and political power to keep their economic and political advantages. So I think we have to be clear that the changes won't happen automatically. But I feel in the United States, I certainly feel hopeful in the United States, and I think I'm using that as emblematic of what will be going on in other countries as well, that we've seen, as we said in the beginning of this conversation, the important role that the government needs to play. We've seen the limits of the private sector. We've seen exposed the inequalities, including on racial lines. And I think that there, at least I feel in the Democratic Party in the United States, there's a renewed commitment to this, what I described as progressive capitalism, to a form of a market economy that realizes the power of the market, but realizes also that markets can be abused and you need regulations to make sure that there's not pollution, there's not taking exploitation, that there's not market power, so that you can combine power with the market, but with the making sure that there is underneath this economic and social justice.
We have 10 minutes to go, Mridul.
Yeah, this is a question on employment, about which you have been writing quite a lot. But this is actually of a feature of, we know that a major feature of employment in the developing world today is the adverse impact of neoliberal economic policies on women's work. So how do you think economic policy can respond to this phenomenon?
Well, let me first begin by saying that part of the differential between men and women, gender discrimination, which is pervasive. I talked before about racial discrimination, disparities in wages and wealth across racial groups. There's also a disparity in income, wages on gender lines. Yeah. And a lot of that is a legacy of the outright exclusion that occurred 50 years ago, and it has taken a long time to overcome that the gendered occupations in general pay lower wages. Why is that? Well, it's because they did in the past. And, I've always said, look at key service sectors like teaching, nursing, caring for the aged. As a society, don't we care about our children, about our parents, about the sick? Clearly, if we ask people, they would all say these are things that we really value. But when it comes to pay, we take advantage of this historical legacy of discrimination and pay the minimum amount that we can get away with. And that seems to me just socially unjust. And as we become aware of this discrimination and its origins in this legacy of deep gendered occupation, hopefully we'll correct correct that. It's not just a question of breaking the glass ceiling. It's much more pervasive than that. Now, there are some ideas that are coming out of the Democratic presidency and a contest in the United States. Discussions about paying for women who stay at home to take care of kids or take care of parents, to try to bring them into some kind of official workforce. How we're going to design that is a difficult matter, but I think, as I say, I think recognition of what is the discrimination is a beginning, but it's only a beginning.
Yeah. So let me ask something which is very dear to my heart, and I want your views on it. What are your views on how it's related with what you were saying earlier on employment? What are your views on how public policy can ensure sustainable development goal, specifically 5.4? That is, to recognize and value unpaid care and domestic work and the promotion of shared responsibility within the household.
Well, there are a number of things. I mean, these are societal changes. And societal change doesn't happen overnight. It is occurring in some societies faster than others. And I think that one needs to look at the societies that are more successful ask, what did they do? And first, it begins, as I said before, with recognition. But one of the things, for instance, that Norway and Sweden and some of the Scandinavian countries have done has had maternity leave, as an example. But it's not maternity leave, it's maternity and paternity leave. That the couple gets a leave, and half of the time, roughly, has to be taken by each of them. So it's recognized that the new family structure is not as asymmetric as it was in the past. That's just an example, but it's part of the way that we do these, make inroads. I think I'm partly because I'm an academic. I always think that knowledge, information matters. And a lot of interesting studies about time use, how much time is spent on various activities by women and men. And I think they're very telling when they point out that women who are in the workforce actually have two jobs. And there's, again, this huge asymmetry. And as that information becomes public, I think there is an adjustment. Let me say, it's not going to change overnight, but it changes. Some interesting work has been done in the World Bank in how does behavior change, and some remarkable success in inducing behavioral change by having role models that differ, who behave differently. So when people see that there are families functioning in different ways, they say, well, that's a possibility that we had never thought about before.
So we're now nearing the close of this conversation. It's been extremely valuable. If there were time, we would have asked you something about the shift to a greener economy that you have written about, unless you want to say a few words about that to close this conversation.
Well, I think that it's an absolutely existential matter. I mean, we have to deal with climate change. And let me say, climate change is more than just global warming. Climate change, rising sea level, increased acidification in the ocean, more extreme weather events, desertification in some parts of the world. Parts of India have been afflicted, floods. It has so many dimensions and is so adversely affecting so many parts of the world. As we've learned more about it, we've become aware of the urgency of dealing with it and the scope of what has to be done. I was on the 1995 Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change second assessment, and we could see climate change coming. We urged doing action, but I don't think we fully anticipated the speed with which it would occur and the magnitude of the effects. And 25 years later, it's very, very clear, and it's very clear that urgency. I co-chaired with Nick Stern, Lord Stern, a international commission that addressed the question of how do we achieve limiting climate, global warming to 1.5 degree centigrade. And the conclusion of our panel, of our commission, very telling. First, it reemphasized the urgency and the scope of what had to be done. But secondly, it said it's doable. We can do it with actually a relatively little change in our society, in our economy. You know, big changes from what we've been doing in the past, but not to our standards of living. In fact, we argued it would be a growth story, that the shift to away from fossil fuels would actually provide an impetus to economic growth, and could be the basis of sustainable increases in standards of living correctly measured. We argued that an important instrument was a carbon tax. The required carbon tax was not that high, maybe in the range of €100 a ton. But we needed to complement that with important public investments and regulations, that we couldn't just rely on a carbon tax. You wanted to have a whole suite of instruments, packages, we called them, to address it. And I think this is absolutely essential, that we recognize the urgency of what of doing this. Now, one of the things I've been talking about, and again, some research that I've done with a group of Oxford and LSE, including Lord Stern, Cameron Hepburn, and a research team, is to point out that we're spending trillions of dollars fighting the pandemic and recovering from the pandemic. We can make that money serve double duty. We can make that money not only help us recover from the pandemic, but also move us significantly towards a green economy. that these green expenditures are timely, labor intensive, have high multipliers. And so this is an opportunity. Never before have governments intervened in the economy at the scale that they are doing today. And we as citizens have the right to say, if you're going to intervene with public money, let's make sure that the economy expend in a way that reflects our values, our views about what kind of an economy we want to have. And I think all of us want an economy that's sustainable. All of us want an economy that climate change. And so we should use this moment, both in the way we allocate the money and in the conditions we impose on those receiving the money, to use this moment as a critical moment in helping create the green society, the green economy.
And on that positive and inspiring note, let me thank you, Professor Stiglitz, for these valuable thoughts and insights, which a lot of people will be following the next several days. You've been very generous with your time. Keep well and safe.
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed it. I wish I could be actually in Kerala. My fond memories of being there in the past, and I look forward once the pandemic is under control, coming back and joining you in person.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Stiglitz.
Thank you.
Thank you.